Hey there! I am so glad that you all showed up because today I'm going to show you a puzzle that I created. It's a math-themed logic grid puzzle. I created it from scratch and I had so much fun creating it and we're going to have so much fun doing it today. And what is a logic grid puzzle, you ask? Well, I think that the easiest way to explain that to you is to show you the puzzle that we're going to do today. So let's get to it. So in today's math-themed logic puzzle, we have three math professors, Professor Adams, Professor Boyle, and Professor Clark, and they arrive at a party in that order. Now, based on this set of statements that we have over here, we have to determine their specialty, where they got their PhDs, and what they're having to drink. And the way it works is each one of these statements is going to eliminate possibilities. And when we eliminate a possibility, we're going to put an X in the appropriate cell in this grid. And eventually, we're going to narrow it down to certain conclusions. And once we make a conclusion, we're going to put an O in the appropriate cell. And when we put an O in the appropriate cell, it's going to populate down here. So this is where we're going to have our final solution that matches each professor with a subject, a college, and a drink. So let's start with statement number one. The topologist went to an Ivy League school. So what does that tell us? Well, Harvard and Yale are Ivy League schools, but MIT is not. So we know that the topologist did not go to MIT. So we're going to put an X in that square. Next, we're going to move on to statement number two. The numerical analyst does not like orange juice. Well, I would bet that the numerical analyst did not order a mimosa because mimosas are made with orange juice. Statement number three. The Bloody Mary was served before Professor Clark got to the party. Well, this tells me that Professor Clark most definitely did not have the Bloody Mary. It also tells me that nobody that got to the party after Professor Clark had the Bloody Mary, but nobody got to the party after Professor Clark, so that does not give us any new information. Statement number four, the martini drinker got to the party immediately before the topologist. So clearly, the topologist is not the martini drinker, so we put an X in that cell. Additionally, we know that Professor Clark can't be the martini drinker, because Professor Clark did not get to the party immediately before anyone. Additionally, we know that the topologist cannot be Professor Adams, because nobody arrived at the party before Professor Adams. And now we're ready to draw our first conclusion. Professor Clark must be the mimosa drinker, because they are not the Bloody Mary drinker, and they're not the martini drinker. And you see that when we put the O in that cell, it populates down here that Professor Clark is drinking the mimosa. Now, as soon as we put an O in a cell, we can also put X's in these cells because this is always a one-to-one relationship. If Clark drank the mimosa, then Boyle didn't and Adams didn't. Now, the next thing we can do anytime we draw a conclusion is we can match up everything we know about Professor Clark with everything we know about the mimosa drink. We don't know much about Professor Clark other than the fact that they drank the mimosa, but we do know that the mimosa drinker is not the numerical analyst, which means Professor Clark cannot be the numerical analyst. So we put an X in this cell here. And now we can move on to our final statement. The numerical analyst arrived after the Yale alum. Well, that tells me that the numerical analyst did not go to Yale. It also tells me that Professor Adams did not go to Yale because Professor Adams did not arrive after anyone. It also tells me that Professor Clark is not the Yale alum because nobody arrived to the party after Professor Clark. So I'm going to put an X in this cell. Now we can draw a couple more conclusions. We now know that Professor Adams must be the statistician because he's not the topologist or the numerical analyst. And now we can match up everything we know about the statistician, which is virtually nothing. And by the way, we could put X's in those cells once we put the O here. That's all we know about the statistician. Do we know anything about Adams? Well, we know that Adams did not drink the mimosa, so we can put an X in this cell. The statistician did not drink the mimosa. And conclusions are accumulating as we go along. Let's take them one at a time. Professor Boyle, we know, is the numerical analyst because nobody else is the numerical analyst. So what else do we know about Professor Boyle? Professor Boyle is not the mimosa drinker, so the numerical analyst is not the mimosa drinker. But we already know that. So this discovery does not give us any new information. What we have discovered is a few more items, though. We know now that Professor Clark is the topologist, which means that Professor Boyle is not the topologist. And now we can match up everything we know about Professor Clark with the topologist. Topologist did not go to Yale, so we put an X here. And the topologist is, in fact, the mimosa drinker. So we can put an O here and an X here. And this puzzle is really starting to take shape now. Do we know anything else about the mimosa drinker that we can apply to Professor Clark? Well, nope, not much. Do we know anything about Professor Clark that we could apply to the mimosa drinker? Yes, the mimosa drinker did not go to Yale because Professor Clark didn't go to Yale. And here's another conclusion we can draw. The statistician must have went to Yale because nobody else did. So we can put an O in that spot. This becomes an X. This becomes an X. And we also know that the statistician did not have the mimosa. So the Yale drinker did not have a mimosa, which we already have. We can also link Professor Adams to Yale because the statistician went to Yale. And Adams is the statistician. So we could put an O here. And this puzzle is really coming together. We can now enter our X's. Professor Adams didn't go to Harvard or MIT. He went to Yale. And before we go on, it's time to go to a commercial break. And now it's time to remind you to please like, share, and subscribe and turn on those notifications. Also, I finally got my new t-shirt. Check it out. As usual, you'll find a link in the description below to the amazing artist that creates the designs for these shirts, and also to the Zazzle site where I got these t-shirts printed. And if you're going to buy anything at either one of those sites, please use my links because it helps to support this channel. And with that, let's get back to our puzzle. And now that we're back, I see that we have to revisit a previous clue. The martini drinker got to the party immediately before the topologist. Well, we now know that the topologist is Professor Clark, and it was Professor Boyle that came immediately before Professor Clark. So it must be true that Professor Boyle is the martini drinker. So we can put it here, an O here, an X here, and an X here. Another conclusion that we could draw is that Professor Adams had the Bloody Mary. And now we can link up Professor Adams with the Bloody Mary. We can literally take these 6 entries and paste them down here. Boyle, we can attach to the martini. So again, we can literally take this and paste it here. Clark is the mimosa drinker, and these 2 rows already mimic each other, so there's nothing to do there. But we do know that the topologist must have gone to Harvard because he didn't go to Yale or MIT, which means that the numerical analyst went to MIT and did not go to Harvard. And that should be enough to solve our puzzle. Where did Professor Boyle go to school? Well, Professor Boyle is the numerical analyst, and the numerical analyst went to MIT. So Professor Boyle went to MIT. And that really does complete our puzzle. Professor Clark had to have gone to Harvard, didn't go to Yale or MIT, and our solution is now complete. Now let's take a quick check to make sure that everything matches up. The topologist went to an Ivy League school. Yes. The numerical analyst does not like orange juice. The numerical analyst did not have the mimosa. They had the martini. The Bloody Mary was served before Professor Clark got to the party. That's absolutely true. The martini drinker got to the party immediately before the topologist. And yes, the martini drinker did get to the party immediately before the topologist. Finally, the numerical analyst arrived after the Yale alum. And yes, in fact, the numerical analyst did arrive after the Yale alum. So our puzzle is solved. But let's just, to be complete, let's fill in the last piece of this grid. Professor Clark had the mimosa, so we can literally take these 6 entries and paste them here. Who had the martini? Professor Boyle. So we can literally copy these entries and paste them in here. Our grid is complete, our solution is complete, and we have solved our first logic puzzle. So that concludes today's logic grid puzzle. I hope you all enjoyed it. And as usual, let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, what I could do better. Your feedback is super important to me. Thank you so much for watching. I am the Math Buddha, and I am wishing you an amazing night and a truly pleasant tomorrow. Have great dreams. Good night, folks.